I'm Chandra De Silva. I'm the Vice Provost for Faculty Development, and it's my pleasure today to introduce David Gordon. He is in the Department of Philosophy. He teaches the theory of knowledge. He teaches analytical philosophy, modern philosophy, and he also teaches a number of general education courses where he stimulates students to think critically. And that's the topic that we are going to deal with today. But he's going to talk about a very special aspect of that topic. How do you teach critical thinking? Through rational entitlement and responsibility. Now, when I first read the title, I didn't quite understand what it all meant. But I was confident that David would explain all this to us. Because this is important not just for students. It's important for people like deans and vice provosts, because some of us begin to think that the conclusions we come to have some special status, and we don't really look at what we conclude critically all the time. One of my friends called it provostitis. So, David, what you're going to do is to give us a set of tools that will help us not only in the teaching of students, but also, hopefully, the teaching of administrators. Here you are, David.
What I want to do today is share with you an exercise that I use in all of my introductory classrooms to give my freshmen and students who are new to philosophy a sort of a from the very first day sense of what the class is all about, what philosophy is all about, what critical thinking is all about, which, since it is part of our mandate to be teaching these kinds of things across the curriculum, I think we should all be finding ways of trying to do in our classroom. And I just want to share with you one kind of exercise that I do on the very first day of classes, rather than going through a syllabus with my students, to try to give them a sense of what this is all about. So let me just start with what I do with my students in the freshman class. You've all been given, I hope you should have a cue card and something to write with. I'd just like you to take a couple of minutes, if you wouldn't mind, please, and tell me what you think about this. Answer this question for me, please. To what extent do you think that individuals should be willing to give up some of their liberties, privacy or mobility perhaps, for the sake of public or national security? So I just want you to take a couple of minutes and think about that, and tell me what you think. Write down what you think. Thanks. Thank you. Excuse me. Sorry. Thank you. I'll come around. Perfect. By now you should have all somebody's opinion. I'm going to give you just a second to have a look at it. Did anyone get their own back, by the way? Did anyone get their own back? No? Sometimes that happens. It actually works kind of nicely for something I'm going to do afterwards. Well then, you've all had a chance to look at them? Yeah? So let me just ask you then, as a show of hands, how many of you are willing to do a straight swap? How many of you are willing to give up what you formerly believed, to exchange directly what you wrote on the card, to give that up as your opinion, and adopt for your own instead the opinion of that other person, somebody else here in this room incidentally? How many of you are willing to do that by a show of hands? I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If I don't remember all of your names, because yours I don't know, I'll come back to you. I'm gathering that means that the rest of you, which for the audience is the rough majority, not perhaps vast, there are half a dozen of you who are willing to swap. The majority of you are unwilling. Is that right? Show of hands, you're not willing to trade your opinion? So I have a majority of people in the audience who are willing to say that. Now, let me ask you another question then, just by a show of hands. Of the half a dozen of you who said you were willing to swap, how many of you thought that this was the opinion you got back was roughly the same as the one you contributed. Okay, so for those of you at home, that's 5 of the 6, I guess. It's almost all of them. Daniel, I think, is the outlier. Is the reason you were willing to swap because it was roughly the same? Okay, perfect. Of those of you who were not willing to swap, just let me ask then, I'm gathering that the reason is because it was rather different than yours. Is there anyone who doesn't fall into that category? You're not willing to swap, but you have some other reason other than it's not sufficiently like your own? I don't have the results, and I'm not going to mess with the slideshow to report your results, but I will say that the results you've given me now, thank you very, very much, you actually recreate what I regularly get in my freshman classrooms when I conduct this exercise. And that is the following. For example, when I did this last week, I had a unanimous unwilling to accept. That is unwilling to make the exchange. That's rare. Usually there's a portion who are willing to make the exchange. And usually if they're willing to make the exchange, they're willing, because of the reasons you guys gave, that it's close enough to my own. Of course, the person who gets back their own opinion should be entirely willing. That is, they should be indifferent, and they're the outlying case to that. But that is, the person whose opinion is identical to your own, seemingly you should be willing to swap. If, of course, you can't figure out what their opinion is, the people who say it's roughly the same, but they're not willing to exchange, these people often tell me that the devil is in the details. The reason that they're not willing to exchange is actually because their opinion is more, so it's not just that it may be more clear than the one you received, but it's more detailed, or it's more qualified, or it's more specific. The general result, though, then is the closer that the opinion is to my own, the more willing I am to exchange. The further away it is, the less willing I am to exchange. This seems to be the result. So the next question that I have for you then, is the other person entitled to their opinion? Are they entitled to their opinion? I don't do it in the classroom, so I won't do it for you. Are they entitled to their opinion? So I have a rough majority. I can't tell whether I have unanimity. Is anyone out there wanting to say that they're not really entitled to their opinion? Well, that, as you notice from the title, is quite what this is about, but I tend not to advertise that spoiler when I do it with my intros. So I want to ask you then, if you don't rather see a bit of a tension in the answers that you just gave. That is, you say that the other person is entitled to their opinion, and yet you treat that person's opinion quite differently than you do your own. You don't treat them equally, you don't treat them the same, and yet I'm presuming that the other person is just as entitled to their opinion as are you. So I'm wondering if you can sort of see that there's a bit of a cognitive dissonance here. You're not really willing to treat that person's opinion the same way that you do your own. So sometimes I try to get my intros to see that, but I've given you a bit of another spoiler. I want people to sort of see that there's a bit of cognitive dissonance here. And because of that, I want people to now perhaps answer the very question that you just asked me. If this is the case, we want to say that the person next to you, the student next to you, or in the row behind you is entitled to their opinion, but you're not willing to treat it the same. What do we mean when we say that that person is entitled to their view? So, what do you mean? Please, yeah, for the mic. Perfect.
I would say that the person is entitled to express their view.
Okay.
Depending upon their qualifications in the subject, or with the subject under discussion. That's how I would place my view of this sounds horrible, my view of the worth of their opinion.
Okay.
They're entitled to express it, but whether I think it's worth anything to me or the discussion is a different subject to me.
Okay. Very good. What else do you mean by entitled?
I would hope that entitlement doesn't mean that you are stuck in that opinion. So entitlement, I wouldn't push entitlement, the right to have and defend your opinion, whatever the evidence. And people do that.
I also do not expect the person who got my card to replace their opinion by mine. And so I think this is a little bit stronger than necessarily saying that you are entitled to express your opinion. I also believe you are entitled to hold any opinion. I like the fact that you actually said both of those. An opinion is a part of our mental makeup, and there's nothing that is more fundamental to our beings than our mental makeup. And so that is a part of who we are.
When does somebody else's entitlement infringe upon my own security, like yelling fire in a movie theater?
Mm-hmm.
So that's when the idea of they're allowed to express their opinion, but if they act upon it, then there's a problem.
Or there might be, sure.
Obviously, the other person's opinion is wrong, but I defend their right to have it, to say it, and there should be no compelling, some other person to change their opinion other than by argument.
Voltaire's view, right? I disagree with you, but I will fight to the, yes. It's a free, somebody just said without the mic, it's a free country. I'm glad that came out. Do I have other answers as to what you guys meant by to say that the other person is entitled? David?
In concurrence with my colleague here, people have naturally given faculties of reason, but I rely on those reasons to change persons' opinions to mine. So I have to acknowledge the natural gift of their reason if I'm to hope that I can persuade them of the correctness of my view.
Okay. Let me sort of show you how the answers that you folks have given me compare to what my freshman students tell me when they're answered the same question. You will see that some of these answers come up, are very similar to the kinds of things that, so the very first one, what does it mean to say that a person is entitled to their opinion? It means that people have the freedom to think what they want and to say what they think. Now, of course, there are qualifications for that, right? Saying things can be slanderous or libel or seditious, whereas, and then subject to control and even persecution in a way, of course, that thinking them cannot, right? Bob Dylan's line, "If my thoughts and dreams could be seen." So what else do my students tell me that it means? Well, and I think that some of these came out in some of the other answers. It means that I will respect them as individuals, even though I disagree with them. That is to say something about the way that I value the person. I won't bear them any ill will, even if we disagree. It means that I respect their opinion. That is, in some sense, we'll have to figure out exactly what they mean by respect the opinion when obviously they're treating it differently, but that I respect their view even though I don't agree with it. It means, as someone said here, that I don't expect them to try to take my view away from me and enforce theirs upon me. And I think that they should be able to expect the same of me. This one wasn't said in quite the same way, but I think David was saying rather something similar to this. We have to count on other people's opinions as starting places in our projects of persuasion, in our all of our other endeavors with them. My students tell me that it means that the other person's opinions are a product of their experience of the world. And although those were different from mine, those experiences of the world were just as valid as mine. And so too were the products of that, their opinions. It means that everyone is allowed to have their own view of things. And well, none of you said this. That no one is really right or wrong. One that I actually took off the list is that they say, well, look, this is the free world. This is a free country, so you can think what you want. And it means that everyone's opinion counts the same, which again is not something that any of you gave. So you're already not quite thinking of this in the way that and I want you to see the difference in the way that a new student coming into your classroom is thinking about this, because they are saying some things on here which you are not really entirely willing to say. Let's see then how well you do with this. You and my students have said all of these very nice kinds of things about the other people, and in some cases about the views that you have taken on, that have been given to you, even though you're not really willing to treat them the same as yours. As someone said, the way that I value the view is differently than the way that I value or attribute to the person their right to have it. So what I want to try to show my students at this point is that they really are valuing these opinions differently. And an example that I can use to do this is to say, well, look, if I had asked everyone to take $1 out of their pockets, their wallets or their purses, and to put that dollar in the hat, and I were to swish it around and you could draw out another $1 from it, how many of you would be willing to make the exchange? Of course, everyone says yes. The people who say no are only concerned with whether they can use it in a vending machine or to get on the bus. They're concerned about the quality of the currency, but they value it the same. And the point is, you can show a student quite readily that they are valuing the opinion differently, despite the fact that they want to say these kinds of things about it, right? They're not actually really valuing that opinion the same. And neither are you. One of the neat things about trying this exercise, doing this exercise in the classroom, is that it locates the problem not anywhere out there in the world, not anywhere in theory, not in something that the student is reading or having to think about for your class. You're locating the problem there in the student. The hope is that the student will feel this visceral sense for themselves. There's a tension in what I'm inclined to say, and yet in what I'm inclined to do. And this is something that the student hopefully needs to take ownership of. And in doing that, they're taking ownership slowly, of a whole kind of critical project, which I'm hoping you'll see the end result of. So first, we try to show the student that they're not really willing to make the exchange, and this shows them that they're not valuing the opinions the same. So then the question that I have for them is, and it's the same question that I'll have for you, since you're unwilling to make this exchange, and since then you value your own opinion more than that you do of your neighbor, what is it that makes your opinion preferable to you? What is it that makes your opinion more valuable? Mona?
Well, I would have said the other person is entitled to their opinion. That doesn't mean I will respect the opinion or respect the person who makes that opinion. Because the fact of the matter is that I hear all kinds of opinions throughout a day, especially if I pay any attention at all to mass media, that I absolutely reject the opinion and the person sometimes for a variety of reasons.
Perhaps maybe even because they have the opinion.
Yes, sometimes because if I'm honest, yeah, absolutely. What an idiot. You know?
You could ask the same question by replacing opinion with, say, husband or wife. Right? I may think that your wife is just as good as my wife, but I don't want to swap. Right?
There's a certain sense in which you're not actually treating them equivalently. When you say just as good in that sense, you are actually meaning something different in each case.
We all put $1 in, and we'll all get $1 out. The context is pretty neutral, except if you put a nice crisp dollar and we're planning to go to the vending machine and you got a crumply dollar and you couldn't do that, that might change a little bit. But in general, the context, I think, is what determines how valued a particular opinion might be.
So what do you mean by context? What goes into context for you, please?
The environment, the situation, the outside factors that might influence your valuing of something.
Okay, sure. Thank you.
Sometimes I value my opinion simply because it's my opinion. And I think that's a very natural tendency. We all try to fight against it, but if you're really honest, that's part of what you do.
If we were in a barter economy rather than the dollar exchange, and you and I agreed that you would give me a stack of wood in exchange for a basket of eggs, we might be very happy with that exchange, each of us. We would probably not agree to immediately exchange them back because each of those had a higher value to each of us in turn. So I see no inconsistency in saying my opinion is more valuable to me than yours, while acknowledging that you may actually feel that yours is more valuable to you than mine.
What is it that makes your own opinion more valuable to you?
Egotism.
See, you
no,
almost got yourself out of Chandra's camp, and then you put yourself right back into it. So,
Well, see, but I agree with Sean. I don't think I'm inconsistent with what he said, because there's a sense in which I know the provenance of my own opinion,
the provenance
and
of it, okay.
and therefore
Right.
can value it. Just as in some cases, if I knew that this opinion had come from an expert in the area of personal liberties, I might actually be inclined to question my own a bit more.
interesting. All right. So, others.
That early opinion, can we go back to that? Because the very first question about liberty, I would want to hear so much more before I said yes or no. And then there is no yes or no to that question.
You made your decision.
The gradations.
Remember the first thing I asked my students? I said, were any of you willing to write down that you didn't feel well enough in a position to take an opinion, to voice an opinion, to offer an opinion on the question? And the students, just as you all very nicely did for me, didn't take that route. And in addition to not taking that route, you were then reluctant to change the opinion, and you didn't say, tell me more. What you said is no. And that's the force of what I want, and that's the force of what I try to get my students to feel, and that is in part the force of what Now, I love where you're going. I think you'll see, many of you, that this is where I am, but I'm trying to structure an experience for my students, and I'm trying to have you feel a similar force to it. So maybe I need a bit of patience with you, but thank you. Yes?
Well, just to add to this, my opinion, I've worked long and hard to get it, right?
Oh, yeah.
So how do I know that somebody else's opinion is valuable?
So
They might
this-
have just come
this-
up with that because they listened to O'Reilly.
So this talks very much about the provenance of the opinion. I worked very hard to get it. Sort of where did it come from? I'm not sure still about the context, but that is kind of what I thought about.
Well, I want to come back in with context. I mean, I look at this learned group here, and I just don't think that they're making opinions based on their own egos. But maybe in part it contributes, but that's still just part of the context. I think that just, attributing like the whole thing to ego is sort of like, a cheap way out. I think that's like that's not full. I think that we're all made up of a lot of different stuff. And my life experience is different from your life experience. And if I were bartering wood for eggs, I'm sure that would have more to do with the context of my being and my space and my needs, right? And not just my ego of, well, I make the best eggs, so I want all the eggs. I mean, I don't know. But I think that just boiling it down to, well, I said it, so therefore it's good, even though I'm learned and and I've studied hard and all that, that's not sufficient. It's bigger than that.
I'm struck by the endowment effect. A flip side of that argument is, it's just too hard to learn your opinion. I don't want to invest the time and effort in understanding your opinion, right? So there's sort of a transaction cost economics argument here. Where I come down on this is actually, I'm not sure that my opinion is right or wrong. I mean, what struck me is in many of these claims is there's sort of an assumption that somehow my opinion is intrinsically right. I don't know if mine is right or wrong, but in my judgment in this random world, I think probabilistically my opinion is more likely the one that's going to be socially beneficial, but I'm willing to make allowances for the fact that maybe there's a chance that yours is more likely. But if I were to weigh the probabilities based on my experience and my judgment, I would say that I think mine is the correct one.
Let me take a moment then and show you how your answers accord, and some of them accord very, very well, with what my students tell me. So yours have some of them in common, and some of them are a little bit different. But first, my opinions are like pairs of jeans. They're not like dollar bills. My jeans fit me better than yours do. I mean, they're basically the same, but mine fit me better. And so if as I was just saying with David, if I'd wanted yours, I already would have taken them, but I'm more comfortable with my opinions. They fit me better. Someone told me that I had invested I knew about their providence. I had invested labor in them. My opinions are things that I've made. They're a product of my efforts and my experience, and it's those efforts, it's the work that I've put into them that makes me value them more. So you are saying things very much like what my students tell me. My opinions are a product of my upbringing. This is the way that I was taught. This is what I was brought up to think, which ties rather in with the last one. My opinions are a reflection of me. Whether you have the egoism that was being talked about in them or not, as Chandra said, he didn't put that in. All he said was, they're mine. They are attached to, they're a reflection of me. They're a reflection of my experience. I identify with my opinions. They're part of who I am. To get me to change my opinions is to get me to change me. Those are the kinds of things that my students tell me. And in some sense, it's very, very similar to some of the kinds of things that you've told me. Now, I'm leading the way a little bit. So here's the interesting thing. You could all state very specifically under what circumstances you would be willing to make the exchange for what they put into the hat for what you did, right? When would you be willing to make the exchange?
When you had nothing in your wallet.
As long as they had something. Sure. When would you be willing to make the exchange? When they put in at least as much or more, right? Well, so then all we have to do is ask you this. Under what circumstances would you actually be willing to exchange? And here, let me instead lower the bar a tiny little bit. When would you be willing to modify your opinion or do a straight out swap, as in sort of a furthest extension of the modification? When would you be willing to modify your opinion for the one that was put in, on the basis of the other one that was put in? When would you be willing to make that exchange?
After you heard more information about that person's opinion.
What kind of information? You want some more background information, okay?
Like what they know about this subject.
Okay.
Their experience.
Okay.
I think if I like the other person and appreciate who they are and you know what they're about. I mean, and I would stretch farther for somebody that I appreciate, you know, that I think, and it's some to do with intellect maybe and experience, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that, you know, but somebody that I have a connection with.
I think at the end of the day, it's really in terms of if you have a dogmatic approach versus non-dogmatic approach. So if you don't have a non-dogmatic approach, you are always open to the other, to understanding, to expressing, you know, to accepting the other opinion.
The kinds of things that you've just been talking about now were not the kinds of things that ever get written on the card. That's in part by design. Anyone else want to tell me the circumstances under which they would be willing to exchange, David?
In a sense, I'd be willing to give up my opinion if I'm compensated for it in some way. Now, so
that might be misinterpreted.
If you allow me to. So, I mean, you know, to build on your example, if you allow me to draw $2 from the hat instead of just one, yeah, I might be willing to do that. But there are compensation in other ways. That is, mutual compromise. You know, you modify your opinion to one that I feel strongly about, and I'm willing to reciprocate. Or alternatively, I can get the benefit of a reputation. So as Mona suggested, if this is a person of great esteem and recognition for their opinion, I can be compensated by being associated with this great thinker or this great person. So there are, because opinions don't exist in a vacuum, I do think we are very transactional in how we think about changing our opinions.
Let me offer you a comparison with what my freshman students tell me. Some of the things you've said are very similar. Some of them are a little bit more, there's a little bit more that's gone into it, but we might expect that. Some of them are on slightly different accounts. Some of you are far more on the practical side in your answers or on the pragmatic consideration side than even my students are. This is what my students tell me. They tell me that if someone could convince me that my opinion was wrong and that theirs was correct. They tell me that if their opinion took into account considerations that I hadn't thought about, if they looked at an issue in a way that I didn't, and they took account of things, perhaps this is part of the background or the context, that I had neglected in forming my own opinion. If someone had better reasons or evidence for my opinion. Now, some of you explicitly talked about information and evidence, and I would invite you, we won't have time to do this today, but to invite you to consider what would trump what in those circumstances. That is, the person's credentials and the reasons that they are offering. A highly credentialed person whose reasons don't stand up, would that trump, or what would trump them? But in any case, what I'll invite you to do, these are our two lists. These are the situations in which, why you said you were unwilling, or why my freshman kids said they are unwilling to trade their opinion. And then why they value their opinion more. And then these are the circumstances under which they said they'd be willing to do it. And I'm just wondering if you can tell me, if you can spot a kind of a difference on those lists.
There's no right or wrong in the first left.
Okay. Professor Brenner's telling us there's no right or wrong in the list on the left, your left, yes.
I think the list on the left has more emotional content, whereas a lot of what's on the right, at least but looks as if it's rational thinking.
A bit more emotional content on the why I say I value it more. Mm-hmm.
The list on the left is sort of more internal about me and how this makes me feel, and the other side is the thoughts of other people.
I see someone else in the audience nodding here.
The list on the left comes from a very intrinsic place, whereas the list on the right seems to at least reach into the extrinsic realm.
I like actually the language of perhaps intrinsic and extrinsic better. The list on the left is very me-centric. All of it talks about the relationship between the opinion and the owner. Strangely, when we ask ourselves, and this is what we volunteer, right? Why is it that I value my opinion more? We volunteer answers that tell us something about the relationship between that opinion and you, its owner. And yet, when you go ahead and ask yourself then, well, actually, when would I be willing to give this opinion up, to change it, to swap it for another one? All of a sudden, these go away. It's not about you anymore. All of a sudden, the reasons that we offer, the conditions for exchange, have to do with things like the relationship between that opinion and evidence and reason and the world and information, how well and how knowledgeable we are. That is, we tend to give this up. And what I want you to sort of see, what I want my students to see about this is that what we say and what we're willing to do are very different. And we're right in what we're willing to do. Okay? We're wrong in why we say we value these opinions. My opinions fit me better. Well, geez, I should be willing to exchange a convenient falsehood for an inconvenient truth. Things that David set aside, quite honestly. We should be willing to exchange a convenient falsehood, give it up, for an inconvenient truth. We should be willing to exchange a hard-earned mistake for an easily acquired truth. Notice about the way that we talk about our beliefs as being a sort of a product of our upbringing. We use this selectively. I give my kids in the classroom, hey, tell me something that your parents think that you just think is wrong. We only, and they all have examples. And notice, when you no longer are convinced of a view, you no longer identify yourself with it. So it's no longer an affront to you to be giving it up. You don't identify yourself with it. The conditions under which we're willing to change our mind then are not me-centric. So at this point then, I try to sort of introduce to them the fundamental notions that I take to motivate my course and the kinds of critical thinking exercises and the stuff that we should be doing throughout the curriculum. A kind of a political entitlement as a difference from, or as differentiated from, rational entitlement, which is why Sebastian's question at the very beginning might be the theme of this: what do we mean by entitlement? Political entitlement is the kind of entitlement each of you granted the other person. It's the kind of entitlement that we grant to everyone who has an opinion, whether or not we disagree with it. Hopefully that we still do respect that person, at least in some measure. That is, they're entitled to certain kinds of things, even though we disagree with them. In fact, we can say that it is it's something that we grant to people, even in the cases where we think that they're dead wrong, or indeed that the opinion might be hurtful or damaging, socially harmful. What is rational entitlement? Well, I try to get my students to recognize, and I hope that you do, that the kind of entitlement that you're claiming for your own self, when you are unwilling to trade your opinion for that of another, is an entitlement of a different kind than this. You're not just saying, no, I don't have to change my opinion with yours. I get to keep it. I have the political right to keep it. I have the political right to think what I want. You're doing something else. You're doing something more. You're actually claiming that you're correct. You're right in your unwillingness to change your opinion with that of your neighbor. And I want my students to try to recognize that what they are actually claiming for themselves in their unwillingness to give up their own opinion is this political entitlement. Is this rational entitlement. So, because of time, I will sort of say these things as opposed to put them in the form of a discussion. I want people to recognize that there are a different set of rights and responsibilities that come with these different kinds of entitlement. As far as the rights go to political entitlement, they're out there. People who claim merely political entitlement, we owe them something. What are the kinds of things that we owe them? We owe them, in the very first place, the right to make up for their own selves, for their own mind, what they think of as the true and the just and the good. As some of you have been saying earlier in this talk, we have to count on their ability to do that well when we come to our efforts to reason with them. What else? What other rights does such a person have? They have a right not to be forced by some coercive or authoritarian means to accept some view. And in many cases, to not be silenced or punished for what they believe. On the other hand, what do they owe us? What responsibilities do they owe us? I leave that as kind of an open question, but I try to get my students to recognize that the responsibilities of such a person are very few. If a person's claiming rational entitlement, how do those things differ? What are the things that change when you move from claiming a mere political entitlement to rational entitlement? What differences are there in the responsibilities of such a person? What more do they owe us? And what differences are there in their rights, the kinds of things that we owe them if they're rationally entitled? These are the things that I try to get the students to accept, to see as that something that they owe us. In addition to taking ownership of their view, to take some sort of responsibility or accountability for it. So they're these. First, I suggest, as some of you have mentioned already, that both that we need and that we have to count on in others, they have the responsibility to engage in reasoned discourse with us. That is, they have the responsibility to provide us with reasons, when challenged, that justify their unwillingness to swap their view with ours, or anyone else's for that matter. It's by claiming a rational entitlement that we open up the possibility of reasoned discourse to settle our differences in matters of prudential concern, in matters of policy, no matter how important or unimportant these views are, to our present needs, that is. Secondly, the responsibility to be rational in their beliefs. Someone said, well, they have to be willing to change or modify their opinion when faced with the way that I've expressed it, when faced with their inability to meet that responsibility. That is, when my reasons don't pan out, when I can't offer you better reasons than the ones that I'm confronted with or challenged by, I have an obligation to give up my view or modify it or surrender it. I try to tell my students that my courses aren't about what they think, but it's about them taking on these responsibilities. And if I can get them to take ownership of those responsibilities, I hope to have done more for them than I could by teaching them anything out of a book. On the other hand, I suggest that this kind of responsibility, this kind of rational entitlement, there's a right that attends to it that doesn't attend to merely political entitlement. Some of you told me that with merely political entitlement, one of you said it just means that they have the right to be wrong. And moreover, in our society, what quite often this means is they have the right to be wrong and ignored by us, right? What do you do in our society when you get to a situation where you're there with a person with whom you disagree, especially somebody who's intransigent about it? You avoid them. You walk away because you know you're not going to get anywhere with them. It's only a person who has accepted these responsibilities that you have any means of getting anywhere with them. And so attendant to that, then, I suggest, is a right that we claim for ourselves when we claim to be rationally entitled. And that is a right to be taken seriously, a right to that others should take heed of our view, to take them into account when forming their own opinion. Now, I would that I had time to reach those discursively. I don't. I'll tell you a couple of other things that I will breeze past because I do want to leave time for questions, and I know that we are at time, so some of you may actually be having to leave, and I understand entirely. One of the things that we might also notice is the case of intransigence or steadfastness of opinion and how we treat that differently depending on whether we agree with the person or not. And how that's a very ambiguous quality when we attribute it to people. I skip over this. I skip over agreement and the function of criticism. I'll just talk a little bit about the end of it. Usually, as I said, with pre-critical thinkers, we tend to evaluate our opinions kind of like you guys did at the beginning, based on whether they're like mine. Opinions that are like mine, I don't subject them to criticism. I let them go without thinking very carefully about them. I agree with them. They're good. Ones that are not like mine, those are the ones where if I can't ignore them, I unleash criticism upon them. Sometimes even presuming the intransigence of the person who owns them. Critical thinkers, I try to tell my students that I will have done my job well if I can get them to think as critically about their own preferred and prized views as they do about the ones about which they vehemently disagree. That criticism is actually, it has a positive, sorry, that's not the slide I want. It has a positive function in our society, that is, the ability of a view to withstand criticism is a measure of its success. So we can't treat our views as very successful when we prize them, but don't subject them to any testing or criticism. I have designed an assignment based on this. There's not enough time for me to discuss it here, but it's available in the paper that I wrote about this, which I'll push on you or talk about it there or mention at the end. There's a rubric for the thing. The structure of the assignment is basically to get a student to say something that they believe, then to tell us when they would change their mind about it, to give us their reasons, and to tell us what somebody else might think about them. The key to this assignment is, again, with more time I would ask you, but I'll tell you what they do. They set a very high bar for what they would love to get to change their mind. They want the world to get them to change their mind. And when they are offering their reasons, they are very, very low. There's a great discrepancy. And the trick is to realize, in doing this well, successfully, is that if my reasons don't pan out, I ought to be willing to revisit my view. There really ought to be a very strong connection between these. And yet we are not, my freshman students at least, naturally inclined to do that. We are naturally inclined to create a very high bar for here and a vast gap between the strength of our reasons and what we would actually want to change our mind. And I try from the very first assignment I give my freshman students to get them to close that gap. In any case, I have written a little bit about this. There's even a syllabus statement for you. If at all you're interested, I'll send you the link. It appeared last year in a journal called Informal Logic. And I hope that there's a little bit of time for questions, though I have gone over. Thank you very much for your cooperation in doing this. You did very well. Thank you.
I'm wondering, do you give a similar assignment towards the end of the semester to see if in fact the gap is closing, and for which students it closes, like if there's any correlation to their grade or some other measure?
To answer your question, no, I don't give them a before and after on this assignment. But rather what I do is all of the other assignments then deal more explicitly with philosophical topics, and they are asked to do very similar things. That is, they are asked to make a case for one of them or another, and when they advocate or make that case, they have to take into account counter considerations or reasons that go against their case, and I want to see that their opinion is sensitive to those. That is, it has a sense of answerability to them. But no, I don't give them a before and after on this.
In the early rounds of the discussion, there was a lot of talk about personal liberties and how they played into this notion of one's opinions. I'm wondering, did you salt that discussion a little bit by making the initial question that we wrote one about personal liberties? How do you think the discussion would have changed if maybe the opening question, instead of giving up personal liberties, had been something like what factors should be considered in choosing a career, or what makes a good university course?
Right. So when I give them this assignment, I try to invite them not to pick beliefs that might be valued, if they will, purely instrumentally. That is, towards a set of goals which might be rationally defensible, but nevertheless are quite individual specific. That said, they get a range of questions. And so here's one that I often use in the classroom. I was convinced by Allison that this one might be one that would be good for you guys. One that I use in the classroom sometimes is, to what extent do you think that governments or companies that arm warring factions should be held morally and legally accountable for the actions of those factions that they arm? Here are some other ones that I've tried in the past. I don't know that I've ever used that one in the classroom, the one that I used with you guys. So you really were an experiment. To what extent do you think that corporate CEOs should be held morally and legally accountable for the actions of their corporations? So I have used this one in the past. To what extent so this one is liberty-based. To what extent do you think that individuals should have to give up their private property for the public benefit, including things like taxation? So some of them are like that. I usually try to pick questions that have some social or moral or philosophical dimension to them, as to prime them for the class. Ones that they can answer by purely instrumental reasoning based on prizing their own goals and not then talking about the rational defensibility of those goals won't be well suited to this exercise, because of the barter examples you guys were giving me. You can value 4 eggs more than the bale of wood simply because you don't need firewood for the winter, but you do need to bake a cake. Yes, Sebastian. Sorry, thank you.
Basically, I'm asking, what can you say to somebody who says, obviously, all my opinions are rational and should be therefore treated with rational entitlement, and anybody who disagrees with me should be treated with political entitlement. In other words, just put it on a higher level, but still be at exactly the same point. And the reason I'm saying this is not because I don't disagree with your list of responsibilities, but the problem, which I see very much in the realm of politics today, is that no matter what opinion somebody has, he can always go and scour the web for some obscure reasons to believe that particular opinion, and he can pretend to follow these responsibilities to any degree that you can easily detect.
You're right. There are some people with whom we ought perhaps just to there is no use. Their intransigence is so much so that the reasoning will actually then have to stop also. But in some sense, to me, this is a sign that they're not sincerely taking on those responsibilities. that's the starting place anyway. I don't know whether I can give you the ending place, if you will, that you're after. That's a minimum bar. You're right, I think it can be faked.
I mean, global warming is a very good example because both sides can give you a whole litany of reasons that justify the unwillingness to change their view. They can also tell you under what circumstances they would change their view, but it's typically, if in 100 years Earth is really, really hot, then I agree that global warming is real.
So one of the things that we ought to keep in mind, as I think David was intimating earlier in the conversation, and indeed as our system of justice is built around, I mean, there are situations for us where the evidence is not yet in, if you will, right? That is, we may not actually have enough information available to us to settle the matter decisively. And so our system is built around the idea that basically equally well-informed, equally rational people could come to differing opinions about these things. I think our system of jury trial is built upon precisely that. So there are kinds of situations where we ought also perhaps be willing to say there isn't enough information available to us. I mean, there are two schools of thought about how to believe in those kinds of cases. One is to suspend judgment until the position is in, that is, until there's enough information to settle it. But sometimes prudential matters dictate that we can't do that, and we have to settle the matter in order to get on with things. And at that point, we ought to be willing, I think, to do a couple of things. One is be willing to tolerate this kind of rational disagreement, and in fact admit that people can roughly be equally rationally entitled to an opinion without coming to an agreement, but yet part of what it is then to take on these responsibilities, as some of you were saying in the discussion, is to be willing to only hold those views tentatively and not dogmatically. Unfortunately, what we tend to find in these kinds of political situations of the sort that you're talking about, like global warming, is they rely upon their, well, I don't know whether that's a good example of it, but in a case where there actually is not enough information to settle the matter, people will still hold their position rather dogmatically. Yes. I have one more question on the floor, if I might, Allison, and thank you.
You know, Sebastian, in your discussion of global warming, I think you're suggesting a kind of ersatz or disingenuous reason as part of that responsibility. But you know, we see cases, for example, of people who disagree reasonably in the sense that you mean it. So there are cases where we are having public debates, and as you suggest, maybe the evidence is not quite clear, and so people are engaged in a responsible and rational way and are very unwilling to change their views because they feel like they have not yet been presented with reason. The problem that I have, you know, Sebastian, I have the sense that the global warming debate is truly disingenuous, whereas some of these others are not disingenuous. The problem is we live in it's not that people lack a reason or information, it's that people have a surfeit of reason or information. So the World Wide Web is really just one big exercise in confirmation bias, right? If I want to prove that there's a relationship between my consumption of diet soft drinks and the incidence of strokes, I suspect somebody out there has claimed that. And I suspect when I Google it, that's going to come right to the top of the search, right? So there is quote unquote evidence that supports my reasoned and rational and responsible claim that my opinion is right. The problem is not with the responsibility. The problem is with what do we mean by reason and what do we mean by evidence.
And you say as we proceed with reasoned discussion, as long as it's sincere, we are doing something other than claiming a mere political entitlement. We're actually in the game now of giving and asking for reasons, and that's the game that we need to be in. The next thing then is, and be willing to own up to these kinds of things and be willing to assert that. But then the other thing, though, that I suppose I might add is, in some sense, an effective course in critical thinking is a course in de-biasing. We like to go about, we have very automatic ways of going about solving these problems. Sometimes they work in some situations, other times the same strategy won't work in other kinds of situations. The confirmation bias is one of the most well known. What you, I think, need to do across a curriculum of critical thinking to do this well is to get the student to, or get the subject, get the person, get the thinker, the reasoner, to see that this is a bias to which they're inclined, and then give them the tools to rid them of it. This is only one in that toolkit. There are many, many more that you're going to need. But as soon as someone can realize the kinds of things like what was on this list, for example, the kinds of things that I'm inclined to say are not actually the kinds of things that I ought to be doing, we've made headway, and the person will, with any luck, because you've located the problem in them, get them to take that on. So what ought we to be doing in a case like that? Get them to realize that just because they find a reason for their preferred view on the internet, it doesn't mean that they're meeting those obligations. So, in any case, thank you very much all for your participation, for your lovely conversation.